When you first hear them, you always make an excuse. It's a neighbour moving around, it's a pigeon in the loft, maybe something off TV. But deep down you know, you get that feeling. And on the outskirts of Sunderland, in a quiet street, on the quietest of estates, Susan McFarlane had taken over the two-bedroom house from a boyfriend who dumped her for a younger model. She'd endured the toughest time getting him to sign over the mortgage to her. She could barely afford it, but she decided to give up all of her perks, all of her indulgences, so she could have her own place, all to herself. Well, perhaps we all have to share what we have, if not with another person, with something on the other side of the Great Divide. Susan worked hard. Surely she deserved a little time on her own. 11 years earlier, that very same house had had a young family in turmoil. Arguments, domestic violence, broken hopes, shattered bones. Visits from the police soon followed by the inevitable council visits, and children dragged away from their unpleasant, foul-mouthed parents. Yet this only happened after their youngest child, Karen, was killed after falling down the stairs. The neighbours knew how badly the little girl had been treated. She'd suffered massive bruising, 3 or 4 arm breaks or fractures, yet still her death was declared an accident. Not that Susan, the new tenant, should have known anything about another family's dirty laundry. However, she did read about the death of a man on TV, decapitated in a road accident outside of Birmingham. She thought it was terrible, and yet never realised that this man was the abusive man who may have murdered his own child in the house where she was living. The tragedies kept on going. The 2 children, aged 12 and 13, a brother and a sister, had eventually been adopted by the same family in Durham. They both died in a car crash along with their new stepmother. Their real mother, now living alone and suffering depression, decided to end it all and kept taking tablets until now she was gone too. Yet rather than being the end, this was merely the beginning of a violent chapter of viciousness from beyond the grave. Like so many of these things, it starts slow, few things being moved from where Susan had put them, followed by the odd knock, a creak or a bang. Susan was in complete denial. After all, she'd lived there for almost 8 months without any trouble. But maybe it was the violent manner of his death. Perhaps his black, headless soul had nowhere else to go. So he returned to where he'd really enjoyed beating up his young family and raping his daughters. She'd been watching a horror movie on TV when she heard a heavy thump. It was so loud she thought it had been someone kicking her front door in. She raced around the house checking everything, and yet nothing had been moved. And just as she settled back into bed to watch the awful shows that are on late in the night of the weekend, something moved the bed. Not enough to lift it, but enough for her to know that there was something in her bedroom. She switched on the main light and she could see nothing, but all of her senses were on fire, her ears straining out to catch any sound that was not coming from herself or from that television. Just then the door opened to the bedroom and closed with a crash so violent that a lamp on the bedside table fell onto the bed. Susan was beginning to panic. She grabbed her phone. She ran down into the kitchen where she tried to rationalize what had just happened. She almost called her mother, her best friend, even the police. But as her heartbeat slowed, she laughed. Imagine getting spooked by a cheesy horror movie, and at that moment, there was a knocking in her porch. Something was banging against the glass. She put the light on and she walked along towards her own front door. She could see the door was closed. She could see through the glass there seemed to be something moving in there. And just as she opened that door, a huge crow started flapping at her. She let kicked the crow out of the door eventually, but day by day things began to get worse and worse. Little by little, nothing major. But the acceleration had begun, and one day when her sister and her 12-year-old daughter visited, something awful happened. The young girl was running around, and whilst in Susan's bedroom, she saw the figure of a man. And as she tried to run, it grabbed her and swung her hard into an old wooden bookcase. The youngster burst her lip and nose and began screaming. Susan's sister Caroline didn't believe a word, yet the child was adamant and could even describe this crazy-eyed man with longish hair and a gap between his front teeth. 20 minutes later, the entire family's at Sunderland Royal Hospital. The child is treated not only for cuts and bruises, but also for shock. Susan kept quiet about her fears, but deep down she knew that whatever had suddenly moved into her home was beginning to flex its muscles. It was the neighbour whose son was a policeman who began to realise just what was going on. He'd told his parents that Jeff, the vicious ex-neighbour, had thrown the daughter he'd been molesting downstairs to her death. They just couldn't prove it. He also told them that following his much-deserved death, that it wouldn't surprise him if he haunted the poor girl next door. They even gave Susan a picture of Jeff to show the little girl, already knowing that it was almost certainly him. On receiving that picture, Susan knew that the figure that she had seen had been the same man. But what was next? She'd tried so very hard to keep on with her life. This entity hadn't hurt her. But from that very night, the war was about to begin. Rustling in cupboards and wardrobes. Whispering from every room that she was not in. Footsteps on the stairs and walking heavy-footed along the hall. And then the commonest form of intimidation, standing at the side of her bed, staring down at her whilst she slept. If ever she woke in the night or needed the toilet, she knew that she would see him and would need to respond, yet this thing loved fear and seemed to feed on it. One night, with her eyes tightly shut, Susan tried to get to the toilet in the hall. She felt two heavy arms around her, tightening and tightening, squeezing the air from her gasping lungs. In the pitch blackness, she tried to scream, and as soon as she started, she felt herself thrown to the ground. Both knees cracked against the wood floor. She almost passed out with the pain. Finally, on regaining full consciousness, she had the realization that she was becoming petrified to be within her own home. She tentatively opened her eyes, and he was there. One evening she was in the bath and she heard grunting. The mirror was all steamed up, yet there was something moving behind the steam. She stood up and leaned over, wiping it clear with a sponge, and could see Jeff staring back at her. She screamed and fell backwards into the water, slamming her head off the back of the bath. She needed 8 stitches to seal that wound, as the neighbours again took her to A&E and brought her back in the early hours of the morning. On opening her front door, the house was alive with noise. All of her TV sets were on, all 3 loud on different channels. The radio was pounding, and at the same old songs, the washing machine spinning despite being empty. The neighbours, who'd made sure that all the lights were off before leaving the house, were amazed to see that all of the lights were back on. Susan went back in and screamed, "Stop it! Stop it!" And of course, nothing happened. Except the neighbour's wife had a tuft of her hair pulled out of her head. She ran out of the house, her scalp bleeding. Her husband asked if Susan was okay, and then headed off at speed to catch up with his wife. That night, as she slept, Susan felt someone getting into bed with her. And as she froze with fear, she felt hands on her shoulders. She could feel him pushing his body against her, and out of bed she leapt, grabbing a heavy ornament, and battered the empty bed with it. No more sleep that night. Instead, the following day, she sought out her local spiritualist church. 4 kindly ladies all came out to bless their house, hopefully removing this violent entity. And after a lengthy session, the house seemed calm at last. 4 months of absolute peace and quiet, and yet there was still one final surprise in store. Susan's mother visited and heard her daughter so happy for the first time in so long. She invited her to travel out to Kendal in the Lake District where her mum and dad had a holiday home. It was exactly what she needed. A break from all this stress and all of the terror that she'd been through. So in the first week of August, she filled the car full of petrol. She left her street for the first time proper. Within the hour, she was dead. And there would be an eyewitness. Derek was a taxi driver, and his car had just stopped at traffic lights near Hendon, where he clearly saw a small red car travelling at speed towards the junction. His red light turned to green, but he stayed put as it was obvious this car would not be able to stop. Derek wrote in his insurance report, "I could see the red vehicle approaching at almost 60 miles an hour in a 30 zone. The woman driving was trying to hit the man sitting next to her, who seemed to be trying to pull the wheel away from her. Just as the car crossed the junction, a wagon, also doing more than 30 miles an hour, hit it side on, rammed it off the road against the corner edge of a building, almost cutting the car in half. I ran to see if either of the occupants were still alive. To my surprise, there was only a young woman in the car. She was bleeding from the chest. She said to me, 'He killed me. He's killed me.' I phoned 999 and gave this exact statement to the police. The lorry driver, Alfred Turnbull from Sunderland, said, 'I saw the car crash too. There were two people in the car fighting.' The police report said that they were looking for a man in his 30s who had left the scene of a major RTA, a road traffic accident. He had wild, crazy eyes, longish hair, and a gap between his front teeth. Susan's neighbours and her mum knew the truth. And somewhere in Sunderland, this entity is almost certainly making someone else's life a misery. There's somebody else wanting to buy a property with murder, rape, incest, assaults of all kinds. Someone will walk into that house just wanting to check it out, thinking, well, maybe I could buy this property. Perhaps it's perfect for me. Little would they know what lay in store.